Welcome to Clydebuilt Conversations by Clydebuilt International. Our guest is former Virginia Governor, U.S. Senator from Virginia, and Vietnam Marine veteran Charles Robb. We spoke to Governor Robb about a range of issues, from leadership, family, and history. Senator Chuck Robb, Governor Robb, you have many titles. Thank you so much for taking time with Clydebuilt Conversations. We so appreciate it. And I know the audience will very much appreciate listening to your wisdom, your experiences. And so again, thank you for taking time.
Thank you. I'm glad to be able to do it.
I'd like to start in 1939. I know family has been a very important thread throughout your life. 1939 is when it started for you, and it started in Phoenix, Arizona.
It did.
Where you were born, and not too long after that you moved to Virginia. But tell me.
No, it was actually, I lived in Ohio. I lived in Arizona from the late 30s to the mid 50s. And then moved to, let's see, I want to get that, I guess it was to the early 50s now that I think about it, because we were there several years up in the northeastern part of the state. In the closest little town was Kirtland, Ohio.
Oh, Kirtland, Ohio.
Oh, you've heard of it?
I have heard of it.
Oh, okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, that's right, for the LDS, yes. Absolutely, you do.
Yes.
And I've been to the
Kirtland Temple there? Yes,
a number of times structure. When I was there. We had various events that sometimes include that. I was at the at Kirtland High School.
Oh, yes.
At that point.
Nice.
And then we moved to Virginia, which is sort of my ancestral home.
Yes.
In 1955, and I graduated from high school here in Virginia in 1957, and I went to the 60th anniversary of my high school graduation with the classmates.
Just last year.
Not all of them I had seen in 60 years.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah, 60 years. And so what do you remember about that period of time when you were very young? Francis and James, your parents, why did they end up in Arizona? What brought them there, and where did they come from?
My father was sort of had a very adventurous spirit, and at some point he had gone out there and homesteaded, but he started out in the infancy of the aviation industry. He got his commercial pilot's license in about 1929 or 1930, I think it was, and he started flying initially for Ludington Airlines, which later became Eastern Airlines, and then he went into the management side at American Airlines and spent, in effect, 2 full careers there, and then wanted to get out and try something else, and he managed a couple of guest ranches down in Ohio. My parents, it was sort of a family type operation, and I was growing up with riding and chaps and a cowboy hat.
Do you have pictures from back then?
I'm sorry?
Do you have pictures from back then?
I'm sure some where I do. That of course was in the era that film once developed doesn't hold up very well.
Yes. And your mother, you were explaining that she was a real nurturer, just a great leader.
Yeah, she was. My grandparents, their individual parents, had both come from families that had done quite well, and they were quite secure financially, and they had both gone to good prep schools, and their parents lost a huge amount in the Depression, and so they had very little to pass on. Their parents had very little, except some works of art and whatever, to pass on to the family. And so it was an extended period of less resources.
Right. I had read that your grandfather, your maternal grandfather, actually had been a campaign manager for President Wilson.
Yes.
Is that true? Yes. And
he was part of his kitchen cabinet.
I see. So he had also been like the director of the U.S. Mint.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. And so the Depression really hit your parents and your family hard.
On both sides.
Yeah.
My father's side of the family, it was a heavy hit, but they didn't have anything, as I say, to pass on. They didn't have any significant family inheritance for themselves, nor did that change during the time that I was growing up. So they thought of going to a prep school, which is not anything that I was anxious to do particularly, but I mean, having that background or going on to college after that was not a part of that experience. I didn't ever feel that I was deprived in any way. It was a full family life.
Right.
But when I got old enough, and when each of my younger siblings got old enough, we were each encouraged to get a job, and we made a contribution to the family checkbook or whatever.
Yes, to reduce debts or things like that.
I'm sorry?
To reduce debts or challenges that you have.
Well, just to make a contribution to the family resources. And when after my father died, actually after my mother died, because she kept his records for a couple of years until she died, but he had perfect records of all of my siblings and exactly how much we'd contributed, and he'd figured out the interest, and he died thinking that someday I'll be able to pay them back. It wasn't that much, it was just a small amount.
Yes.
But it gave us a sense of being a part of an enterprise that we might not have been as aware of.
Right. Do you feel, as we talk about leadership and leadership attributes and qualities, that period of time, seeing your parents experience that, does hardship, does it shape a leader? Does it as younger people?
It could be very valuable to anybody in a position of leadership to have been able to work their way through a process that requires discipline, and it's a very good asset. You don't want to go back and repeat it. It's simply like, it's a little bit like going back to repeating boot camp in the Marine Corps. It's a great process to have evolved from,
And you, so that period of time, of course, you were very young, but do you have any memories of World War II ending, or family members who had served?
Minimalist. We used to always go to the Saturday afternoon matinees, and there would always be newsreels, always with music and great shots of gunfire with the big ships that had the up to the 16-inch rounds, and you'd see those all going off. That you never saw anybody actually die. So it gave you a very unrealistic picture at that age. And we'd go to the Saturday afternoon matinee. We'd save whatever we had of our allowance in that period and go to the matinee, and they always had they were almost all westerns. Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, Hopalong Cassidy, was it Tom Mix? I didn't see many of those, but
and you had then. Did you have family members who had served in the war? Or
no, I did not.
Not directly.
For whatever reason, my father was at that time in the aviation industry, and that was a war component. So he did not serve.
And then when you moved to Virginia, like when you officially moved back to like your ancestral home.
Yeah, but again, I had a detour through Ohio.
But when you moved to Virginia, when did you end up? When did you start in Virginia? Like when was that?
That would have been in 1955.
55.
All
right.
I attended my last 2 years of high school down at Mount Vernon High School, down the road.
So the 1950s, 1955. What do you remember about that period of time? 1955, 6, 7. About Virginia and going to high school. What stands out?
I remember it was a transition because you get pretty well, at that point I had been living in Ohio in those relatively formative years from junior high and high school, and you get a number of friends, and you don't. In fact, I stayed behind. I was caddying at a golf course, a golf club in it was the Kirtland Country Club for that matter. And when my parents moved here, I spent the remainder of the summer with a friend who came back for our 50th wedding anniversary, which we celebrated over in this part of the house. And we invited everybody that had it was still alive that attended our wedding. And it included some high school and some college friends.
That's amazing. So it really was a formative, even though a short period of time, it was very formative for you. And then it will skip a few years, but then you ended up at the University of Wisconsin. Yes.
Yes, after high school.
Yes.
At that point, I knew that there was no way that my parents were going to be able to send me to college.
Yes.
And I knew it would involve a scholarship.
Yes.
That I was going to have to do that, and combination of scholarship and work.
I see.
And I applied, as I think most people did at that point, to all three of them. You have 3 blanks, and I applied to. For some reason, since my parents, although they'd been to very nice prep schools, they hadn't gone on to college, and so there wasn't anybody within the family who was trying to convince me to go to a particular school. And I ended up thinking about, and I was very much into the STEM education, which wasn't known as STEM then. And I ended up applying for engineering scholarships and attendance at 3 Ivy League schools, including Yale, Dartmouth, and Cornell. Cornell offered me far and away the best scholarship, but it required that you maintain a certain grade point average. And I had been just coasting through junior school and high school and whatever, and at the end of my first year, you were required to be, I passed all my courses and everything, but you had to be in the top third of your class.
I see.
And I fell just below that level.
I see. And then you sort of transferred to University of Wisconsin or started?
No, I transferred at that point, but I applied for 2 different scholarships.
I see.
Late in my year there, not in anticipation of that, but I joined the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps.
Right.
And one of the options there was the Marine option, which is the one I took. But they had vacancies in certain schools and universities. My parents had then moved to Wisconsin, and they were strongly encouraging me to go there, and I decided that I did. And then I switched from an engineering background to switched into a BBA, Business Administration. But I got involved in a whole lot of things. And I apologize for the hoarse voice here.
Oh, no, that's okay. No worries. That's a great time to be going to Wisconsin. That's when the Green Bay Packers were really trying to... Vince Lombardi himself moved there about that time, late 50s. When you were there at Wisconsin, were there any leaders in particular that stood out for you that you remember that were formative or mentors in a way that either
you tend to remember your coaches and certain teachers. I remember in Latin we had a woman who was a good deal older than most of us. I'm just guessing at this point she was, I shouldn't say it now since I'm past that stage, but she was either in her late 60s or early to mid 70s, and she had a tendency to she was not married, and so her whole life was really wrapped up in her students, and if they played on a team that was playing in that particular season, they all got very good grades in Latin, and that undermined my sense that you had to work that hard, because it all seemed to come so easily.
Yes, yes.
But you do get a little false sense of security, particularly when some of the other football players,
yes,
or the other basketball players,
yes,
you know are not great students,
right,
and
right.
they get good grades in just one.
And so you had lots of examples of good teachers and students and friends from that period and you were in this, you were engaged with Naval Reserve training as part of, it was an ROTC.
At the University of Wisconsin,
right,
yes.
Sort of an ROTC program, yes.
Right, I ended up being the brigade commander of all the ROTC units on campus.
There's so much, remind the listeners, of course, as I'm speaking to Senator Robb, all these momentous occurrences in U.S. history, the Second War and the 1950s, even the Korean War and that period. And as I reflected on that period of time, 1963, 55 years ago, next month is when President Kennedy was killed.
Yes. I actually met him as a senator running for president at the University of Wisconsin when I was there.
Interesting.
He was there to make a speech.
Yes.
I was working in one of the hotels just off campus as essentially a bellman or whatever the case may be, and I was also working in one of the fraternity houses as a waiter. All this in addition to the NROTC scholarship. I'd started out as an NROTC contract, which is the non-scholarship program for the same thing, and it doesn't have the same requirements going in, and it doesn't result in a regular commission. But once I went, I got two results at that particular point. One of them, and the other one, I was encouraged by the Naval ROTC instructors, which included the Chief Marine officer who was there, to apply for a competitive appointment to the Naval Academy. The formal announcement for the NROTC scholarship which is a full ride, came through before I got the word back from the academy, and so I got ready to start on my what I guess they call the third class cruise, which is you're the one you do it between your freshman and sophomore years.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, no, I get that. That's right.
Freshman, sophomore.
And halfway across, I was embarked on a destroyer, and you basically live in the enlisted quarters, and you do things that are normally associated with the enlisted ranks in that period of time. Halfway across the Atlantic, we got a message that congratulations, this is to let you know that you have been selected for a competitive appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. If you choose to accept, disembark, row to Spain, fly right back to Annapolis, and what have you. And I said to myself, I don't want to do the first year again. But given the fact that the military was such an integral part of my DNA, and the Marine Corps in particular, it would have made perfect sense for me to do that.
Yes, and so that moment where you, if we talk about that 55th anniversary of President Kennedy being killed, you said you had met him, you were inspired.
Well, I met him then, yeah, that's right. But at that point, I had I'd been my first active duty assignment had been as the executive officer of. I had joined the Marine Corps and been through OCS and what have you, or a program that was then called Training and Test Regiment, that has since been called, the last 50 years have been called OCS. I went through that, and my first assignment, some very good things happened to me in my period at the basic school, basic officer school at Quantico. And from that assignment, lots of other really good assignments that I could never have asked for came my way. And it allowed me to, but the first assignment was the executive officer on the USS Northampton, which was then a highly classified mission. And we had, then President Kennedy came aboard and joined us for a couple of days at sea. And he brought with him all of his, the Joint Chiefs, including the Commandant of the Marine Corps, to whom I was assigned as the escort officer while I was there.
Interesting. What do you remember about, I think for the listener, please go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say the most memorable single experience we had was, and I don't think that the Defense Department could afford it today, but they had all of the warships in the Atlantic Fleet pass in review at sea. And so we had President Kennedy in the conning tower, and on the bridge. I'm sorry. I'm like a carrier. I spent a fair amount of time on carriers later on. I've been on lots of different ships in the Navy with the Marine Corps. That was the only time I was on a Navy ship. But in any event, it was the most majestic scene you can imagine. It was over 60 ships, all bristling with all of their guns, all on display. Everyone had manned the rail. All of ship's company at whatever number of levels that particular ship had. And our ship was all at manned the rail. And we would go by and they would exchange cannon salutes, which is traditional for when you've got the president aboard.
Did the president offer remarks as part of that?
No, I mean, we had. It was not a speaking event for him. It was basically a learning event for him.
What do you remember if you were to describe President Kennedy's leadership qualities? How would you describe President Kennedy?
Well, he was youthful and energetic, and he and Jackie were a handsome couple, and I got to know her much better later on in life. In any event, they were very charismatic, and I mean, it was sort of our vision of royalty in that respect, and he had a good sense of humor, and he could fit right in.
Part of the assignment, when you mentioned the USS Northampton, that also led to a significant meeting also in your life, and that was Linda Bird Johnson, right?
Well, that was much later.
Much later, okay.
Yes. Fortunately, I got all of the really cushy assignments out of the way before I ever met Linda.
Okay.
Otherwise, they would have all been suspect, I'm sure.
Yes.
I mean, but the good things that happened to me at Quantico and basic officer training led to all those assignments.
I see.
So it was a reverse. You get all the good stuff.
Yes.
Or what it, but I very much wanted, because I had been the honor graduate of the basic school class, and so they gave me the assignment. I would never have asked for assignment to shipboard duty at that point.
Yes.
Or not on the command ship. It was CC-1. It had the most modern communications gear of any ship in the Navy at that point.
Yes. It would be extraordinary to see where they are now in terms of.
Well, they're in razor blades.
Yes.
All those ships that were. I don't know that
museums.
There are maybe a handful of ships that are that old. The USS Constitution, of course, is still the oldest ship I don't know whether they call it an active commission, or I can't remember or not. But I did have a chance one time. That's much later on when I was in the Senate. They invited a number of members of the Armed Services Committee to come and do a short sail. It was going to be the first time, I think, that it had been out of port or dry dock or wherever it had been, and we went out and we each had an opportunity to take the wheel for a few minutes, I remember. And Walter Cronkite was along with us and capturing all that on and I got to know him much better later on. But
wow, these are luminaries. Just the people that you're describing are, again,
most of that came from my time down at the University of Virginia after I had come back from Vietnam, and then I'd headed up the major officer recruiting program for the Marine Corps, and I got to know a whole lot of people, mostly people who were considerably older than I was and senior, and so instead of being buddy with all of my contemporaries, I got to be friends with many of the. This is over a period of time, and my next assignment after that was to the 2nd Marine Division in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and after a short period of time there, they selected me to be the aide to the commanding general who was coming in, or to be the junior aide by virtue of rank at that point. I was still a first lieutenant, not yet a captain. And he was they were pre-selecting a junior aide for him, and he was going to have a chance to select his own senior aide. Well, after a short period of time, we hit it off great, and he selected me as his only aide. So in a position that normally would be someone one rank higher, and where there'd be 2 of us, I was his aide for the whole time that he had the 2nd Marine Division. And then when he got transferred, I got on a battalion landing team that was headed for the Mediterranean, deployed, and we would be theoretically at least the landing force if anything broke out in that area. We did landings on several of the countries around the Mediterranean where there was enough rural area that we wouldn't tire up the whole city with the tank treads and whatever.
So again, you were married December 9th, 1967, so you were mentioning your 50th anniversary, coming up on your 51st anniversary.
That's right.
And
incidentally, Linda has an interesting distinction.
Yes.
There are a number of presidential daughters who've been married during the time their father was in the White House. Not all of them in the White House by any means, nor was her sister got married. He was at her wedding took place at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. But after I came back from this other tour, I'd been ordered to Marine Barracks 8th and I, which is the ceremonial post of the Corps. It's also where the Commandant lives, and where the Marine Band is located, and the Marine Drum and Bugle Corps. So that's all the ceremonies in Washington, whatever. That was, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but we went, when I was aide to the commanding general of the 2nd Marine Division, he, obviously I went with him every place that he went, and when he played golf, he invited the commanding general of force troops, Don Robertson. Major General Van Ryzen was his name. He is now long departed, as is Don Robertson.
Yes.
But Don Robertson ended up I don't know if it was his next assignment or what, but he ended up being the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division in Vietnam when I reported in, and I was concerned at that point that I wouldn't get what I really wanted, was to be a company commander, an infantry company commander.
Yes.
of the Marines in a combat environment.
You had trained for it.
That's why I was trained for it, and I wanted to prove to myself that I was as good as the Marine Corps seemed to think I was.
Yes.
And I would never have forgiven myself, but it was not easy. I was getting better assignments than you could ever ask for.
Yes.
And it wasn't until I finally got, I was at the, in addition to being the adjutant at Marine Barracks and part of the parades, that it's the best free entertainment in Washington.
So you were saying that Linda had the distinction of being the only
daughter
as being married at the White House?
Of being married, who got a chance to celebrate a golden wedding anniversary.
Ah, nice.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
And we're she's the last presidential daughter to have been married in the White House.
I see.
After that, Tricia Nixon married Eddie Cox in the Rose Garden, so they weren't really in the White House at the time.
I see.
And they can eventually catch up to us in terms of being the second couple, but you have to broaden the definition a little bit to say while their fathers were president.
You've described her as your partner in life. You've said she is the love of your life and the mother of your 3 almost perfect daughters.
Right. That's.
We talked about your 5 grandchildren now, which they're probably perfect, right? The grandchildren.
No, there couldn't be. Our last 2 came from compliments of our youngest daughter.
I see.
The other 3 now, they're both in their very early tweens, double digits or whatever, and then there's one who's still in single digits from that family, and she celebrated her 50th birthday, or is celebrating it this month, in about 2 weeks actually. But Linda's already taken her on a trip to give her birthday present.
Well, for the listeners, let me just describe, as I engage with Senator Robb and know him a little bit as he's talked about family, he just beams with pride about family, and that's certainly a thread throughout his career, his life, is family. And so for those family members who may be listening to this many years from now, it's certainly, I would describe it as good pride, genuine pride in family. And I would just ask you again, as we talk about leadership, can a career for a younger person just starting out with her career, who's ambitious and is hungry, can a career be too consuming that it potentially compromises the gratification of family life?
Well, there's no question that if you're in any important position, if the male member of the marriage is in a job that requires a great deal of time and attention, and then I went back to law school after I came back, and then headed up the Marine Corps Officer Recruit Program. Mm-hmm. The loving spouse is the one who really does all of the nitty-gritty work of raising your children. Right. And I would go to special events in their lives if I could. Yes. If I were not either overseas or.
Is there a way to keep the balance? Like, is it pulling on
if you're
you?
Lucky enough to have a spouse like I have, who can pick up all of that. Her mother used to say that if people ask her what she would do for her father, she said, I would follow him around and thank everybody for whatever they had done to bring about his attendance at an event or whatever the case may be. Yes. Linda did a very good job of that for me. I would have a scheduled speech before an organization, whatever it was, and I'd be sitting up at the head table thinking about what I was going to say, or making changes to whatever notes that I had in a prepared text, and she'd go work the entire audience. So I got credit for that. She's very easy to like, and she's got lots of stories.
I remember seeing a famous photo of President Johnson, again, for audience members, President Johnson being Senator Robb's father-in-law, a famous photo of him in the White House bent over,
Yes.
like feeling significant pain.
He had been listening to
Yes.
a tape that I had sent to Linda, not thinking that he would ever see it, but I was aware of the fact that he was occasionally asking her if he could read my letters. And he said, "This is, I need this," or whatever. And he had just played it for the cabinet. I was still over in Vietnam at this point. I didn't know anything about that at the time. Everything was in kind of delayed fashion in terms of when I would get the message. The assassinations that took place of Martin Luther King Jr. and his Robert Kennedy took place while I was over in Vietnam, and I did hear about them on Armed Services Radio or whatever we had access to, and you had Stars and Stripes, which the helicopters would drop off with beans and bullets if you're in the field. Or if you're back at your combat base, they would have them there, and so you could read about some of those things fairly contemporaneously.
Do you remember what you were speaking about as you recorded that message to Linda?
Yes, I was. We were on an extended operation in what we call the Arizona Territory. I was in my whole TAR, Tactical Area of Responsibility, was in Quang Nai Province, Quang Nam Province. I'm sorry, and it we on just the other side of the Song Bujia, which was the river that came closest to our combat base, was area that the NVA controlled for the whole time. We never had a permanent presence there. There was a Special Forces outpost to which we provided convoy protection and whatever to get stuff out to them and resupply from time to time.
So he was feeling he had played that recording. You were simply describing.
Well,
those
he
events.
he then wanted to play it for his cabinet.
Yes, that's fascinating.
He had just played it for his cabinet.
Yeah.
And Yukio Okinawa, I think the photographer who took that, who was the photographer most of that time, and had a couple others that I got to know later. Yoki, I think, took that picture, and it wasn't published until Life magazine did a story, a retrospective, and then it became sort of an iconic photo.
Yes, well, that description, the depth that you're describing, I think many people equate it to the weight of the Vietnam War.
There's no question that it weighed heavily.
It was very personal as well.
He became much more of a, I mean, he was always religious, but he was not as, it wasn't such an obvious part of his day-to-day activity.
Yes.
As when he would order missions in Vietnam and knew that there were going to be lots of casualties on both sides. And that was one of those traumatic experiences.
You came to know him, obviously, as your father-in-law. We've talked about these caricatures of politicians and business leaders, actors, celebrities, and it's sort of a cardboard. You knew the person, you knew the human being, and when you think of President Johnson as your father-in-law and someone, the father of your wife, how would you describe him?
Well, I tell a lot of people when they ask about him, I said, whatever you've heard about him is at least partly true. They're a part of his legend, if you will, involves pieces of fact, and otherwise they're a interesting connectivity to a fictional piece of the story, or what somebody else may have thought was excuse me, was going on at the time. But yeah, he's had a strong. He was an imposing figure. He had great love for his family. Not only his wife, who was his anchor, as his first daughter was my anchor, in life, but for his grandchildren, that he got to know our children before he died, and they never really got to know him all that well.
Yes.
And of course, our great grandchildren will.
Yes.
Still don't. Most of them don't have any real concept of what he was all about.
Yes. I feel an extraordinary story for, again, the audience to hear about with Senator Robb relates to when in Vietnam had been going through the challenge of being separated from family and then returning from Vietnam and then meeting your daughter for the first time 6 months into her life. Is that yeah? And that
it was essentially her 6-month birthday.
Yes.
When I came over on the armed services would charter civilian flights, take the whole flight, and just march all of the troops that were going either direction. I went over that way and came back the same way. We stopped in Hawaii to refuel, and then came back. I think we came back to Los Angeles, and from there I got on a regular civilian flight and flew to Dallas. And there to meet me was my wife and my 6-month-old daughter that I had not yet seen.
Amazing.
And Linda's parents, President Johnson. He had a little king area he had down on the ranch, and he'd flown up in that to greet us.
Yes.
And we all flew back to the ranch before we went on back to.
And
back here.
Do you remember? Was Linda holding the baby, or who was?
I think she held her up like this.
Yes.
And
yes. Wow, what an extraordinary experience.
It was clear that she didn't know me.
Yes. And you have often very articulately spoken about how when families are separated, whether it's the military separation or the foreign service, as you know, is separated often in hardship assignments. When any family goes through that, it seems often the brunt of the stress is borne by the family who is back.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Linda, it was much tougher for Linda and we talked about this and the decision to start a family. She said, well, that'll give me a project. And that project is being the sole parent for the first 6 months of life of a youngster. And excuse me, she would write me all the time, or send me tapes of her father. When I left for Vietnam, gave each of us a little portable tape recorder, so that we could do that in addition to writing. We didn't do it all that often.
I see.
But I could, because I was aware of the fact that we hadn't announced the fact that she was pregnant at that point. It wasn't announced until about 6 or 8 weeks later. But I knew at that point, and so we would talk about, and we had a nickname for the as yet unborn child that she was carrying. She used to call him Thumper. and our own children, with their pregnancies, have had a nickname, and the name of the one who was just born 8 days ago, late Sunday night, just to give it an easy identification, he was called they knew ahead of time it was going to be a boy.
Yes.
He was called Raspberry. And they had a name like that for their first child.
Yes.
Who's now almost 2, and is way too cute to be a boy. I mean, he's got all the charm of a young lady.
Once again, the pride that Senator Robb is showing right now is just so clear, and he's just dripping with the pride, speaking about 8 days ago. That's special. So you then came back. You mentioned, you talked about UVA and your experience there, going to law school. Then you had, I know
while I was there, the most interesting experience, and where I got a lot of this interaction with some of these people that I hadn't necessarily had until that time. When I was at 8 to 9, I was also a White House social aide, which meant that whenever they had state dinners or other big events, that whatever number they thought they needed to have to help that event run smoothly were assigned to put on their dress uniforms and go over to the White House and carry out whatever duties were assigned. I was often assigned to be the officer who stood right next to the president and introduced people as they came through the receiving line to him. That was a frequent.
Interesting.
So he knew me as somebody that apparently did that job to his satisfaction, because he wouldn't have had any reservations about asking the social secretary to make a different choice if he had.
Let me draw on your wisdom before we move on from this point about families being separated, just your wisdom from your own personal experience.
Yeah.
How do families who are dealing with that now or may deal with it in the future, whether they're foreign service, military, business, academic, whatever it may be, what's your advice to families as they grow through that type of experience? How to deal with that?
Well, I don't know that I have any all-purpose advice. I mean, every family is unique to a certain extent, and certainly you want to convey to whoever's away that they are loved and missed and all of those things which most families would share in terms of their feeling. And you would want them to feel as good as you can. I mean, it goes both ways. The family left behind tries to reassure, particularly in the service, that whoever is the person who's deployed, they hope that he or now she is safe and that they'll come home in one piece and reasonably healthy.
I want to get to these subjects before we run out of time. Get to one I think one of your most favorite jobs, one that you were after you had come back from Vietnam, been to UVA, been JAG, started to think about politics, but not in a way, as I understand it, you would engage with the audiences and you would feel as you listened to them that you really truly could make a difference by engaging on the issues that they were talking about. That fed your interest in politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was elected the president of the Student Legal Forum in law school, the same organization that both Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy had headed up when they were in law school.
Interesting.
Because I think that the feeling was that you have access to more people that'll be interesting to talk to. So my role was to recruit from around the country people, in most cases, that I had already met, either at the White House or someplace, and get them to come on their own nickel.
Yes.
We would cover transportation expenses, but there was no honoraria for any of the speakers that we had. So it took a certain amount of personal persuasion on it.
Yes.
And then I would introduce them to the audience, and I normally ask them to speak for only about 15 minutes or so, and let's take Q&A. And the only one that let me down on that one was Hubert Humphrey. He just went on and on and on. He was very good. It was one of the best speeches he ever gave.
Yes, yes.
We had a couple of them that were not open to the public. They were at their request. Earl Warren, as Chief Justice of the United States, was one of them, and and Thurgood Marshall.
Ah, wow.
Both came and spoke at the just to law students.
Yes, amazing.
They didn't want to be in a public situation.
Luminary. And again,
and we had, among others that I'd invited down, was George Herbert Walker Bush, who at the time was chairman of the Republican National Committee.
Interesting.
So, and I gave you a couple more. One was Father Berrigan, who had led all of the anti-war demonstrations and whatever were taking at that place. and the other one was his name is suddenly escaping me.
You're doing really well remembering.
He was the head of the Dump Johnson movement, and it was just a little bit before Linda's father passed away. As a matter of fact, he passed away while I was in law school and while we were living in Charlottesville. And President Nixon very kindly sent a plane down to take us down. Was it one of the courtesies that are frequently offered and made a part of all of the families of presidents. Whenever we get together for an event, it's usually a funeral or the opening of a new library or a memorial, whatever it is. But there's always a lot of interaction, and we develop individual friendships that we always look forward to renewing that. We've been to the last 3 or 4 funerals of either presidents or first ladies, and we've been to both, where you get a chance to meet the other presidents and first ladies and the other family members.
They're humanized.
It humanizes the whole situation. Yes.
So when your drive to engage in the political arena, I know I've read that Linda had some hesitation.
She wasn't pushing me to do it.
Yes, but you had a real desire to do it because you were engaging with audiences, you were hearing diverse perspectives, you were feeling like, I can really make a difference. I can affect change by getting involved in politics. That was the driver.
Once you realize that you can truly have an effect on people, how they feel, what they do, what they believe, then it's an empowering feeling that comes about.
Right, and I remember that about your career. A real thread of your career was a person who was very engaged on the issues themselves. Like you really prepared thoughtful remarks, almost not to a fault, that's not the right word, but you would, I remember your speeches on the Senate floor, they were very highly detailed, like you didn't...
the ones I felt best about on going to the Senate floor, we've now skipped my whole gubernatorial term and everything else in between, but on the Senate floor were the ones that were not politically popular, but that I knew I had every reason to believe would eventually be find approval in history. And I felt far more empowered when I came back from making a speech that I knew was going to create all kinds of political difficulties, but that I felt good about myself. I felt that I was really making a difference.
Right. As governor, you said that's one of your favorite jobs.
Yes, no question.
Right. And in some ways you've said, even though it was a real honor to serve in the Senate, it wasn't your favorite job, just being a...
My favorite job far and away was being governor.
Yeah.
And if Virginia had permitted succession, I think undoubtedly have run for a second term. Everything was looking good at that point. That it had not been a very democratic state, except going way back into the history and segregation and whatever. But in modern times, many of the people on one side had switched to the other party, who had those kinds of outdated views, and so that while both parties started off with a reputation, one, the Democrats were representing a whole lot of the segregationist past, and the Republicans, particularly the Mountain Republicans, were much more progressive. We managed to switch that around, and we didn't try to make the Republicans less progressive or whatever, or identified with some of the hot button alt-right images or whatever. As
that being your favorite job, I think I often call you Senator Robb. I may just start calling you Governor Robb.
I was going to say, people who know me know I don't stand on any
I'll call you Governor
title, whatever, but I much prefer, because it's a job that I thought I was better suited for.
Tell me about the value being a chief executive, again talking about leadership qualities, the importance of a leader that listens. Do you feel
a leader
that listens?
Absolutely. That's one of the most important elements of leadership, is the not only the ability, anybody can listen, but the desire to listen and to hear what the other party has to say, and to not demonize everything that you know about the other party, whatever the case may be. Find ways that you can, Linda's father's phrase for it was reason together, come together. Find something that both sides can feel is in the long-term best interest of their country, their state, their whatever the jurisdiction that we're talking about.
And he certainly did that with civil rights.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, right. You served in the Senate. Again, there's so much we could talk about in as far as your term as governor, which was a very influential term in the 80s. Your service in the Senate, you served a bit going back to Vietnam with combat veterans of Senator John Kerry, John McCain, Bob Kerrey, Max Cleland, Chuck Hagel, and there may have been others. But
I think that may be it. Oh, there was Bob Smith from New Hampshire, I think it was.
All right.
Who was one of the holdouts for there are U.S. prisoners of war being held in tiger cages or whatever it was. And we could not disabuse him of that view. But the rest of us, I think, all came to the conclusion that there was no one left being held against their will at the time of this particular event that took place. Or if there were, of course, there are in all wars, some desert, switch sides or whatever the case may be, and then some who desert and feel this there. That you read stories about them every now and then that they went to North Vietnam or something and now they want to come back to the United States.
That's an impressive group of people. The Senators Kerry, yourself, McCain, Kerry, Cleland, and Hagel. And when we talk about working across party lines and being coalition builders,
we could all do it.
You did it. They did it.
And I will have to tell you that. Again, going back to getting more satisfaction of giving a speech is not politically popular, I spent more time in the hideaway of John Chafee than I did in my own hideaway. We frequently would have meetings of people from both sides, about equal representation approximately, and we would discuss some of the harder issues, particularly with respect to taxation and major energy policies, whatever the case may be, but with a desire to find a way to make the system work. My concern today is that it's very difficult. You still have some people from both sides who want to get together and want to be responsible leaders, but there's too much, and it's true in the country, there's so much polarization. We're so much more tribal. And tribe comes first, rather than reason, or a long-term desire to affect positive change that will make a difference for the country.
And you often, when you were governor and also in the Senate, but you talked often about pride in government and governing, honesty and integrity, themes, of course, that are a part of the Marine Corps. But also just the history of the state itself, built on Jefferson and these luminaries that talked about the purity of governing, the higher calling of doing that. And you often talked about that. And I remember, again, this principle that you're describing of working across party lines to try to solve an issue for the purpose of solving a problem, because it's an honor to serve. And that's what that's what I recall.
And I do, if this is the same theme that you were heading for, the fact that we don't give enough credit to the rest of the professionals in government. They're viewed as strictly being political animals, and in many cases they're really not aligned with a particular party. Many are, but the desire to serve and the feeling that they're doing something that makes them feel better about themselves.
Yes, and you have, again, for audience members here, the Robertson Foundation for Government, for example, is something that you've devoted some time to, or the concept of younger people, in this case graduate students, having a desire to serve government. And
yes.
That's a positive desire.
Yes.
And an entity like the Robertson Foundation, but other entities, support the principle of public service for the
absolutely the requirements to get a fellowship with the Robertson Foundation. And again, there's no relationship personally. As the start of the last name is the same, but
yes.
the grandparents that established the whole A&P food empire left a significant chunk of money to Princeton to set up an institution for the promotion of government service,
yes.
particularly government service internationally.
Yes.
And when Princeton got a little off the straight and narrow on that, and the heirs of the family, they were paying other expenses with the money that was supposed to just be dedicated to students who were going into the Foreign Service or
yes.
whatever else might be.
So I think for folks can list, if there are students listening, students may go to the Robertson Foundation for Government, and these are fine universities, Texas A&M, Syracuse, but there are lots of different universities encouraging government service. One can serve one's country in the military, as you have, but there are multiple foreign service, civil service. And
I've been a lifelong advocate
yes, you have
of government service
yes.
By everybody.
Yeah.
In some form, a national service. It doesn't have to be military. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the government, but something that gives people some sense of ownership of what they've inherited.
So as we come here to the close of this conversation, I wish we could go on for 2 more hours, but tell me about if you're engaging with younger people, and you almost think back to those days at UVA or when you came back from Vietnam when you were talking to university students. If you're in front of a university audience now of younger people, what do you tell them based on your experience, your life experiences, family, professional? What's important in life? What do they have to look forward to?
If you've got an audience in front of you, chances are you're not going to spend a whole lot of time. Whoever introduces you will probably give enough of the background. They're in most cases to hear about a particular topic or a particular series of experiences or something else. So you don't spend all that time talking about yourself. People ask questions, and that normally draws them into whatever it is you're discussing. But I would go around when I came back from Vietnam and headed up it was called the PLC program, but it's the largest source of Marine Corps officers. And I would go around to various college campuses then and make speeches, whatever the case may be. And one was particularly memorable. I was invited to come up to speak to one of the Philadelphia universities. So I went to all 4 of them during the course of my visit. But one of them had put together an open public forum where they had everybody that they could come in anti-war costumes or death masks or whatever else, and they were prepared to dislike me intensely. It was some sort of a automaton, and I managed to, instead of a little more formal introduction, I just walked on the stage. I'm there in my let's see, I think I did these in
Dress blue.
I'm there in the Marine Corps officers' dress uniforms with ribbons and badges and all that kind of thing, and all the gold buttons that are on that type of outfit, which I happen to feel very good wearing. In any event, if you start talking and listen, or if they shout out anything, there's a couple of stories that were published at the time. One in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which indicated that the group started out hostile, and they ended up giving me a standing ovation. And that somebody smart on President Nixon's staff noted that, and so I got from him on that pale green stationery that is only used by the president, a complimentary note, the fact that I'd, quote, won over. I realized I didn't change any votes at that particular point, or I don't think I'd have changed all that many votes, but I tried to convince the audience that the folks that were receiving were just like they were.
Right.
It all had a human dimension.
Right, and you provided hope, and so there is hope for the future, yes?
Absolutely.
And you were describing Raspberry, whose name is now
his name is now Joshua Linden.
Joshua Linden.
His father's name is Joshua. His great-grandfather's name is Linden. Now, the very first one that particular family had, they named, again, these are all daughters. I thought that the last names had to be the father's name. They chose, in that case, to name their first son Charles S. Robb. And I knew nothing about it. I was not consulted. I didn't think it was possible. I went over to see the baby in the hospital, and they said, we're going to name him.
That's a tearjerker.
And this next one also, the daughter who teaches calculus right down the road here at Langdon High School is, what was the point I was going to make? I mean, I'm acknowledging the fact that my next birthday is 80, and you don't have all of what anybody tells me they want to live forever. I say, in your present body, with your present mind, your present eyesight, your present hearing.
Well, the fact that you remember all of this is extraordinary. And so for Joshua Linden, it's beautiful, the idea that you and I are just chatting here, and that this child is...
I don't expect to be around when he's 20 years old and just back from the first 2 years of college. We're setting up a little 527 for his education at that when he becomes eligible for it.
Yeah, and it'd be, but the future is bright, and so for family members that may be listening somewhere in the distant future, your grandfather is saying the future is bright, and your public service has been a real example to me and to so many others.
Well, you're very kind.
But your form of leadership also has been a real constructive form of leadership.
If you'll listen, and if you command respect, not just obedience, respect. People actually believe that you're attempting to either lead them in a direction that makes sense and in which they want to be a part, of which they want to be a part. People will follow you in a combat situation. You're going to be ordering units under your command to take a certain hill or whatever the case, an objective, and you know that if you send a platoon in one direction, a platoon flanking, whatever, that there are going to be a lot of casualties, and you want to have confidence that they understand, and that's the reason boot camp is supposed to be challenging. But there's some things in life that I believe you have to believe in enough to risk dying for them, and that's the way I look at service, and particularly in the military service, or at some of the other firefighters, policemen, whatever the case may be, in civilian service, where subjected to real risks of serious injury or death, it's got to be, they've got to believe that they're doing it to be a part of something bigger and more important in the overall scheme of things.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Clydebuilt Conversations from Clydebuilt International. Please visit us at clydebuiltnow.org. Thank you.